We were just given a break, but it is now quarter past the hour, and we do have 3 talks in this session. So I think I'd like to go ahead and get started with these next talks. And first up in this session, Dr. David Inouye, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Maryland and a PI at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, and who has really shaped a lot of our thinking about phenology in response to climate change. So Dr. Inouye today will be talking about how the phenology and abundance of Rocky Mountain wildflowers are changing in response to climate change and what the implications are for pollinators. And because we have we have 3 talks lined up, please write your comments in the chat and we'll go through comments in our questions session. So David, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jill. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk to this large group of international researchers. And a lot of what I will say, many of the things that I'm going to mention are going to sound familiar in the context of the talk that we've already heard from Jill. This is an overview of the area where I work in the West Elk Mountains of the Colorado Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory is located in the East River Valley here, not far from the ski area town of Crested Butte, Colorado. This is what the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab looks like. This is at 9,500 feet or about 2,900 meters altitude. Very lush environment to work in during the summer. However, during much of the year, it looks more like this. We get a lot of snow there and quite a range of snow. Some dry winters with only 4.7 meters, very heavy snowfall, and the other extreme of 16 meters of snow falling. We're also close to a climate hotspot. The biological lab is shown here with that blue symbol. But if you look at temperature change from 1895 to 2019, there's a real hotspot here in western Colorado and in eastern Utah. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the climate. I'm not going to say much about global climate or climate change per se, but at our site, the regional climate variables like the North Pacific Oscillation, which is a 50 to 75 year cycle, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is a 2 to 7 year cycle, also the quasi-biennial oscillation, those all interact to affect the local climate in terms of how much snow we get, what the snowpack is, when the snow melts, how much rain we get, what the temperatures are. Those interact to have effects on frost, which I'll come back to later, and then major effects on a variety of aspects of phenology, including the phenology of migration, like the broad-tailed hummingbirds, my phenology of the emergence of pollinators like queen bumblebees coming out from spending the winter underground. Also, the major effects on the flowering phenology of basically all the species of wildflowers out there. This is a phenological calendar of sorts showing up at the top right here, the first species to bloom in the summer, which is Claytonia spring beauty, which comes up within a day or two after the snow melts, or flowers within a day or two after the snow melts. Then the willows, Erythronium grandiflorum, the glacier lily, a delphinium species I'll talk about, strawberries, violets, daisies, and then on around to the gentians that flower at the end of the summer. The project which Jill alluded to already is one that a group of us set up in 1973. Most of us were graduate students working at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab on pollinators, including both hummingbirds and bumblebees. And we decided that we would set up a study by establishing 2 by 2 meter plots in several different habitats, and then go around for the rest of the summer every other day and count all the flowers of any species that bloomed in those plots. And my collaborators kept their plots for 2 or 3 years. My wife Bonnie kept hers up for quite a few years, and I've kept up a number of those plots consistently since 1973. So we've now counted millions of flowers in those plots over the years. couple of the plots are shown in those pictures. One of the things that we found is that frost can have a significant effect on flower abundance and that it's linked to phenology. Here's a picture of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab on the 13th of June in 2001, and the temperature that night got down to minus 5.8 degrees centigrade. You can see that the vegetation was already up at that point because the snow had melted quite a bit earlier. And I want to talk a little bit about a species that's frost sensitive, has sensitive flower buds that are sensitive to frost, and that's Helianthella quinquenervis, common name aspen sunflower. I've worked on this for over 50 years now, in part because of its mutualism with ants. It secretes extrafloral nectar from the involucral bracts, and that solution of amino acids and sugars attracts ants that then patrol the flower heads and end up chasing away flies that are trying to lay their eggs on the flower heads, like this taffridid fly. If the flies are successful in laying eggs, their larvae eat the developing seeds, so they're significant seed predators. This is a very common wildflower. This is a site maybe a couple hundred meters from one of the sites that Jill works in. And you can see it's a very common wildflower about the beginning of July. But here's a picture of the same study site, the same time of year, and there are no flowers. The plants are still there. They're long-lived perennials, but in this particular year, all the buds got killed by frost. I've been counting the numbers of flowers in a couple of permanent plots starting in 1974. A couple things to point out here. One is that there are a number of years with 0 flowers or close to 0, and those are mostly years in which there was significant frost damage, killing most or all of the flower buds. Another point to make is that the frequency of frost damage seems to be increasing during the decades I've been following this. And a third point is that there seem to be cycles of flowering, about 13 to 15 year cycles of flower abundance. And I haven't yet figured out exactly what's causing that, but I believe it's related to climate. And there is a paper that has demonstrated that there are about 15-year cycles of climate in this environment. If you plot the number of unfrosted flower heads, so the ones that look like this in the lower right picture, against the day of year of snowmelt, there are very few flowers in these years that are in blue, because those are years in which most of the buds got killed by frost. So early snowmelt leads to significant frost damage. These are long-lived perennials. I suspect some of these plants live 75 or 80 years. So if you have the occasional year where there's no seeds produced because of frost damage, that's probably not a big issue. But as these years of no seed production become more and more common, it's likely to have an effect on the demography. This is a result of a stochastic IPM model that my former postdoc, Amy Eiler, produced, looking at the lambda, the potential for population growth in years with or without frost damage. And you can see if there's significant frost damage, the best that can do is hang in there with a lambda of about 1, meaning the population is likely to remain stable, but there's a potential for it to grow significantly if there is normal flowering without frost damage. This kind of event affects a number of other species of frost-sensitive plants at the biological lab, and also has been demonstrated in the recent decades in agriculture, not only in Colorado, like this picture from a farmer's market in Denver shows, where the farmers are reporting a 70% loss of peaches because of a late freeze. But we're seeing more and more this event of a false spring, and that triggers flowering, and then that's followed by a frost, which will kill most of the buds and result in no fruit set. That's been shown around the world now, and including crops like wine grapes. So let me talk a little bit about how these kinds of climate changes are affecting pollinators, and that's both through effects in the phenology of both the plants and the pollinators, and also then those effects on the abundance of floral resources. Here's an example of the kind of range that we see in flowering phenology, plotting the mean day of the year of first flowering by the Claytonia, the spring beauty flowers. It's happened as early as the 24th of April the mean has also been as late as the 14th of June over the years that we've been studying it. Each of these data points is 1 year. So a lot of variation. Another species that I'll say a little bit more about is the Delphinium natalianum, an early larkspur species. You can see that it's flowering before the aspen trees in the background here have leafed out. It's a relatively large flower. The nectar's back here. I've torn away one of the petals so you can see the nectar spur. And it's an important nectar resource for bumblebee queens when they first come out of hibernation. This queen with a long tongue, so she can reach that nectar, is carrying pollen that she collected from this species. It's also an important food resource for the broad-tailed hummingbirds. If you look at the total number of flowering plants in a permanent plot, which I've started monitoring in 1991, you can see that there's over a magnitude of order variation in the numbers of plants flowering. If you plot the maximum number of either flowers, which are the upper line, or flowering plants, inflorescences on the lower line, those are both strongly related to how much snow there was the previous winter. This species, however, is not sensitive to frost and have not yet been able to figure out the causation behind these correlations. I don't know how it is that the plants are detecting somehow, responding to this variation in how much snow we get the previous winter, in terms of how many plants they put up and how many flowers those plants make. So if you have ideas about that, I'd be very happy to hear about them. Another plant that's responding to climate change is this bluebell species, Mertensia ciliata, which is also affected by herbivores, in this case, a lepidopteran that's webbed the inflorescence together and is inside there eating them. If you look at the maximum number of flowers that have bloomed each year since 1973 in our plots, starting about the late 1990s, there was a precipitous decline in the number. And this plant has also basically disappeared from the lower altitudes where it occurred back in the 1970s, based on observations by Graham Pike, who did his dissertation work on bumblebees and used to work with this plant at lower elevations, came back in the early 2000s and found that that plant was no longer there. So I think the climate has changed enough that this plant no longer occurs at what used to be a lower altitude. Let me say a little bit about a pollinator, in this case, a butterfly, Spirea mormonia. This is a butterfly that is worked on by Dr. Carol Boggs at the University of South Carolina. And she happened to mention to me one year when we were sharing dinner at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab that she had a long-term data set, but hadn't been able to figure out why it was so variable. So she hadn't published her population studies of the butterfly. And she happened to mention to me that this species of aster, Erigeron speciosus, also pictured here, was an important food resource for the butterflies, and that the number of eggs they can lay depends on how much nectar they can collect. And it turns out this is a frost-sensitive species. The maximum number of flowers that we see is closely related to how much snow is left on the 30th of April. If the snow is pretty much melted by then, there's likely to be frost damage and no viable flowers, therefore no nectar for the butterflies. And we were able to put our data sets together and show that the population growth rate, the butterflies, is strongly related to the ratio of flowers per butterfly the year before. So if there are not many flowers, there's a very low ratio or a negative ratio of flowers per butterfly, and the population declines. If there are a lot of flowers per butterfly, then the population growth rate increases. So there seems to be a pretty strong link between decreasing snowpack from the warmer springs and earlier snow melt that increases the incidence of frost damage, resulting in fewer flowers and therefore less nectar for the butterflies, and then fewer butterflies the next year. And I'll make the point here that it really takes long-term data to figure out what's going on in this kind of story, where we were able to explain 80% of the variation behind the population changes from year to year in the butterflies. And that's pretty unusual for an insect species to be able to explain that much of the variation. This shows data for Erythronium grandiflorum, the glacier lily. the first day of the year when we see them in bloom is very dependent on how much snow there is, and also the arrival of the migratory hummingbird pollinators, which are dependent upon that glacier lily as the first flower that they visit when they arrive. But the slopes here are not identical, which means that there's the potential for a phenological mismatch between the plants and the animals that rely upon their nectar. And that situation is getting worse as the climate changes. We've also found out from work that Graham Pike and I did in our dissertation research in the early 70s, and then a resurvey in 2007, that the queens of bumblebee species are moving up in altitude, presumably in response to the changing climate. The growing season is getting longer. Here we show data for 2 time periods, 1974 through 83 in blue, and 2003 through 2012 in red. And the later time period, the growing season starts earlier, lasts longer. And this dip between peak flowering early in the season and later in the season is getting more pronounced, which means that species like bumblebees and hummingbirds that rely upon flowers in the middle of the summer are running the risk of not finding as many flowers to visit. In terms of their phenology, if we consider the historic phenological pattern in terms of flower abundance over time, one question is it just shifting to get earlier as the climate changes? And the answer is no. What we're seeing is this kind of scenario where individual species either contract their flowering or extend their flowering period. Some become earlier, some don't change the date of flowering. So it's really creating a new environment in terms of floral resources for flower visitors. Dr. Becky Irwin from North Carolina State University joined our project 15 years ago and started monitoring insect populations through a combination of pan traps and netting. And so she counts the bees every 2 weeks at our study sites. And we now have 15 years of data to match between what we're seeing in what she's finding in the bees, what we're seeing in our flowers. Here's an example for 3 bumblebee species, Bombus bifarius, flavifrons, and Apositus. And we look at their dependence on flower days and total flowers available, and how those in turn depended on precipitation and snowmelt date. And 2 things to point out, these relationships are not all completely identical. Floral days and floral sum affect the 3 different bumblebee species differently, which means that we can't generalize and say, well, here's what's happening to pollinators with climate change. We have to say, well, here's what's happening to Bombus flavifrons in terms of how its floral resources are being affected. So that complicates the situation with regard to pollinators. We do know that poor floral abundance days are increasing, and for groups of pollinators, including bumblebees, solitary bees, flies, butterflies, and hummingbirds, for 11 of those 13 species of pollinators, the poor floral abundance days have increased significantly during our study. And those poor floral abundance days are related to snowmelt. So for snowmelt date and temperature and precipitation, if these colored lines overlap the dashed vertical line, they're not significant. But for snowmelt date, for 11 of the 13 species for which I show data here, snowmelt date is changing to be earlier and producing more poor floral abundance dates. I'll give you 2 quick examples I think I have time for how these species flowering is influenced by climate. One is a gentian that I've studied for 50 years, and the other is a common name corn lily, Veratrum tenuopetalum. Both of these are mass flowering species. Here's a picture in a good flowering year. They're visited by bumblebees and up to 60 or 70 other species of insects that are pollinators. I'm also studying their demography. Here's a plant that is about 30 years old. You can see it's not gotten very big up in the alpine tundra. Here's that individual plant, which we followed. And here's a researcher who's actually younger than that plant is. I do an annual count in the East River Valley along this transect of how many of these gentians are flowering each year. And it varies dramatically, a high of over 30,000 plants. This year, I think the count was about 20 of them flowering. And so one question came up on what triggers these mass flowering events. And it turns out it seems to be how much rain we get. If you get a lot of rain in July and August, 4 years later is a good flowering year. And that 4-year interval is because of the fact that these plants preform their leaves and their flower stalks for 4 years in advance. So it takes quite a while for that peak flowering to show up. And it took me 32 years of data to figure this out. Here's one that I planted from seed in 1982. 20 years later, it flowered at the biological lab. The other species of this veratrum also has impressive flower stalks. It's a long-lived perennial. You can find about 20 years to 25 years of plant between the end that's rotting away on one end and growing forward on the other. It also preforms its leaves and its flower stalks, and it clones in years in which it flowers, but only in the years in which it flowers. Here's how big some of these clones can be. We think that some of the clones are probably 500 or 600 years old. And they also have a mass flowering, which does not correspond to the flowering of the gentian that I've talked about. Amy Eiler and I published a paper about a model she came up with that suggests that if you have a cool summer, that 2 years later, because they're preforming leaves and flower stalks, you get good flowering. So if that model's true, correct, then from 1928 to 1983, there would have been about 22% of the years in which flowering would have been triggered, compared to 1984 to 2010, only about 15% of the years would lead to flowering. So if the climate is changing to warmer and drier, we're likely to see less flowering. So in general, we know the climate is changing. Snowmelt dates and flowering are getting earlier. The frequency of frost damage is increasing. The abundance of some flowers is declining. Mass flowering events may decrease because we're getting less rain and warmer temperatures in the case of the gentian and the veratrum. Pollinators are being affected in terms of their phenology and abundance. Variation in the responses of different species is going to lead to altered and new interactions, both between or among plant species and between plants and their pollinators. And finally, long-term data are really critical to unraveling these kinds of relationships because it takes many years to get enough data points to do the kinds of analysis that I've showed you. I'll stop there and be glad to try and answer some questions when we get to the chat.